I'm Double Donut. I'd like to talk to you today about Devil May Cry. Devil May Cry is an action game released in late 2001 on the PlayStation 2 by Capcom. Originally conceived as Resident Evil 4, its fast-paced gunfighting and swordplay were deemed too big a departure for Resident Evil, and it was repackaged as a new series. Players control Dante, a professional demon hunter hired to investigate an ancient castle. Armed with 2 pistols and a magical sword, players are put up against strange monsters and Resident Evil-like puzzles. However, Dante is exceptionally agile. Unlike action games of previous generations, Dante is defined by his ability to smoothly transition between actions in all 3 dimensions. Players also unlock a host of special moves and weapons to use during combat, far outstripping the amount of options available to players in older 2-dimensional games. Skilled players are able to unleash spectacular combos on their enemies, including launching them up into the air to juggle them similar to many fighting games, some of which were developed by Capcom. Players also faced boss enemies that challenged the player to utilize their huge arsenal on an enemy that couldn't be manipulated and comboed as easily. This helped introduce the world to what are often called rival fights, bosses who are very similar in capability to the player character. I consider them to be the best kind of boss fight invented thus far, but we'll have to talk about those at a later date. The game was popular enough to spawn a host of sequels with different settings, more complicated gameplay, and different playable characters. The game also gradually got further away from its Resident Evil roots, focusing more on the fast-paced combat rather than exploration, though some of that has always remained. I'm going to be focusing on Devil May Cry 3 here, primarily because it's my favorite, but most of this will apply equally to 4 and 5 as well. The first game holds up reasonably well, but it's quite different from the later games, and while a lot could be said about Devil May Cry 2's troubles, we're not going to talk about that. Before we continue, I want to make sure everyone's familiar with what I've been calling situations. I covered these extensively in my Sekiro video, which I recommend watching, but if you don't have time for that, here's the quick version. Video games, particularly action games, can be divided into different situations that the player finds themselves in. Essentially, the game demands some kind of response from the player in order to progress. There's 3 main parts to a situation for my purposes. Recognition, where the player must determine what the situation is. Analysis, where the player must determine what response they want to make. And execution, where the player must actually press the buttons to take action. These can be altered in different ways in order to modulate difficulty or change the flavor of a game. For example, Sekiro aids the player in recognition with some obvious telegraphing and focusing on one-on-one fights against humanoid opponents, while demanding precise execution in many situations. Devil May Cry tackles these 3 parts of a situation in very different ways. To begin with, recognition is not necessarily harder, but requires different thinking. Fights in Devil May Cry nearly always involve multiple enemies, and the player is nearly always outnumbered. In Sekiro, this is often a very bad position to be in, but in Devil May Cry this is business as usual. Devil May Cry characters are very well equipped to fighting multiple opponents at once. Devil May Cry also confronts the player with more heterogeneous foes. Sometimes this makes their capabilities more obvious, but sometimes their tells can be very tricky or subtle. Before I can speak on this further, however, I need to tell you about a completely different game. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater is a series that started in late 1999 for the PlayStation. Players control a famous real-world skater, a created character, or a guest character to complete various objectives in increasingly fantastical locales. The first 3 games have a very similar structure. Players load into a level, then have 2 minutes to complete as many objectives as possible before time is up. Completed objectives stay completed on later runs, but any unfinished objective will reset. Several objectives in every level will require the player to reach a certain score by successfully performing tricks and comboing them together without landing on the ground. A combo will end, however, if the player crashes or lands badly, also known as bailing. The player also needs to collect the letters S, K, A, T, and E in each level, as well as level-specific objectives that often include grinding specific rails, doing specific tricks in certain locations, or exploring to odd places in the level. Finally, there are also tournament levels that act as a sort of boss fight. Players get 3 heats of 1 minute each to get the highest score they can in a smaller than normal level. The player is ranked based on their 2 best heats against some AI opponents, and generally has to get at least 3rd place to advance to the next level. Later games would change this structure a little bit. For example, the 4th game removed the overall timer and instead gave the player timed challenges they could activate from within a level. But the overall gameplay stayed very consistent. I'm going to be focusing on Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 here, primarily because it's my favorite, but most of this will apply equally to the other games as well. Also, I like the symmetry of this sentence with what I said earlier about Devil May Cry 3. Now, it's a little harder to apply the situation lens to the Tony Hawk series. Levels are composed almost entirely of unmoving, static obstacles, and while there are some moving parts, it's very rare that they react to the player's actions. What this means is that the player is free to create their own situations to perform the objectives the game asks of them. Because of this, recognition becomes much more proactive. Rather than reacting to an enemy's actions, the player will likely examine the static level in front of them before deciding what the best route for them to take will be. Analysis and execution, however, are more familiar, at least once you understand how the combo system works. A combo ends when the player either bails, which ends the combo for no reward, or when the player safely lands, cashing out the combo for points. Tony Hawk's 2 and 3 would give the player more options to string different kinds of tricks into each other, providing opportunities for more elaborate combos. The points awarded by a combo are determined by a base score and a multiplier. Every trick performed will increase the base score by a certain amount, depending on the trick, and the multiplier by 1. Tricks that can be held for periods of time, such as grinds, will increase the base score as long as they are held. Additionally, the player has a special bar that fills up as they do tricks. When full, the player can perform special tricks that are worth far higher base scores, but often require more time commitment or are more difficult to use in other ways. To complicate this, every time a trick is performed during a run, it is worth fewer points the next time it is used. For truly high scores, a player will need to increase both the base score and the multiplier by using a wide variety of tricks, preferably repeating tricks as little as possible. The player also needs to keep the timer in mind as well. While an ongoing combo can be continued even if the 2-minute timer is up, bailing or landing will end the combo and, by extension, the run. So because of all of this, analysis becomes the player's ability to understand what tricks they can use on their route, as well as remembering what tricks they currently have access to. A skater can have up to 42 tricks equipped at a time in Tony Hawk 3. Execution, meanwhile, is the same as it ever was. The player needs to have the correct aim and timing to successfully perform tricks, and tricks such as grinds and manuals require the player to manage a balance indicator. When you combine all of this, the end result is a game where the player's main opponent is themselves. It's very unusual for the game to throw anything unexpected at the player, aside from strange physics interactions. In my experience, anyway, the most common way for a combo to be ruined is through my own hubris. Analysis and execution in Devil May Cry are much more similar to Tony Hawk than to Sekiro. Sekiro operates on a sort of question and answer system. The player has a small amount of actions that often work as direct responses to enemy actions. These responses are often mutually exclusive, or heavily biased in reward towards one response in particular. The game telegraphs many enemy attacks in obvious ways, making it clear with a little experience what the best options are. The challenge in Sekiro comes from reacting quickly enough to input the right reaction without fumbling or panicking, as well as learning complicated or fast-paced enemy patterns. Unlike Sekiro, the actions available to the player in Devil May Cry have a great deal of redundancy of purpose, at least at first glance. Nearly all of the player's actions are merely different ways of doing damage to a target. While some may have different properties such as moving the player a certain way or attacking different amounts of enemies, if the player's only goal is to defeat their enemies efficiently, they won't need all of the options available to them. And there are certainly many options available. Like Tony Hawk, the player in Devil May Cry has a huge amount of actions they can perform at any time, with Devil May Cry 5 in particular giving the player dozens of options depending on how they've decided to set their loadout. So what's the point of all of this? Well, I haven't mentioned Devil May Cry's signature system, the Style Meter. While in combat in Devil May Cry, the player is shown a style ranking on one side of the screen, represented as a letter grade starting at D and going up to S, double S, and triple S. Attacking enemies, dodging attacks at the last moment, and other successful actions will raise the style meter, not unlike a numerical score in many video games, such as Tony Hawk. And again like Tony Hawk, the style meter will drain if the player continues to perform the same moves without any variety, and the player is heavily penalized if they take damage during combat, not unlike bailing in the middle of a Tony Hawk combo. At the end of a level, the player is given an overall grade on their performance. The style meter is always very important to this grade. This means that the analysis section of every situation is based around the player's previous actions more than the enemy's current actions. Rather than be able to remember a small amount of options that could be specifically called for at any time, the player needs to remember a huge amount of options that they can use whenever they want, provided that they remember to use a wide variety of them. I don't think execution is fundamentally different. However, the wide variety of options does mean that the player can pick and choose which options work for them. If you can't figure out how to use the electric guitar weapon, that's fine. You're not penalized for simply using something else instead. This also means that players with very high-level execution can express themselves with amazing feats of dexterity and be rewarded in-game for it. The monsters the player fights in Devil May Cry are, of course, much more proactive than the static environments in Tony Hawk. But as I mentioned before, the player is extremely mobile in Devil May Cry, and can easily deal with multiple opponents by comboing them. Many enemies can be freely comboed at any time and are always susceptible to the player's attacks. Others might require a bit of negotiation before being comboed, while the most dangerous are the ones who are never fully vulnerable, including the game's bosses. I've got a decent amount of experience playing the Devil May Cry series at its highest difficulty, and one thing I've noticed is that my fiercest opponent, even above the highly aggressive enemies you face at high difficulties, is my own hubris. Or perhaps my own hunger would be more accurate. Getting high grades on high difficulties requires the player to skillfully balance risk versus reward, and to not get so caught up in their own actions that they forget what the enemies are doing. While it's possible to complete the Devil May Cry games without paying attention to the style meter, it would be kind of like playing the Tony Hawk games without completing the score objectives. It's certainly possible, but you'd be missing a big part of the game's appeal. The Virgil fights in Devil May Cry 3 and 5 provide another parallel to Tony Hawk. Virgil is Dante's brother and rival, and has very similar capabilities to the player. In fact, he's playable in the special editions of 3, 4, and 5. These fights generally follow a simple pattern. Virgil will continually attack the player with a variety of patterns, while occasionally leaving openings for the player to exploit. At this point, the player has the chance to combo Virgil unimpeded for a short period of time. Drop the combo and Virgil will immediately begin attacking again. Perform the combo long enough and Virgil will obviously jump away from the player, making it clear that it's his turn again. This forces the player to alternate between focusing on defense and focusing on offense, distilling the game down to its bare essentials, not unlike Tony Hawk's laser-focused tournament levels. So, we've got what appears to be two opposing philosophies of action games here. One based around singular answers to specific questions, and one based around an open system that rewards creativity and variety. Can these styles be reconciled in any way? The answer to that is a little complicated. I definitely think it's possible, but I'm not here to prescribe game design. Instead, I'm going to talk about a few games that use elements of these two styles together. I also want to make it clear that although I've used Sekiro, Devil May Cry, and Tony Hawk here, they are far from the first games to use these philosophies. I just find them to be some of the best examples of them. The works of Platinum Games, particularly Bayonetta and The Wonderful 101, take very obvious inspiration from Devil May Cry. This isn't at all a coincidence. The director of both of those games, Hideki Kamiya, also directed the first Devil May Cry. Like Devil May Cry, both of these games score the player on their performance. Additionally, both are fast-paced action games with highly mobile player characters. I don't think I need to elaborate on the comparisons to Devil May Cry's style of action, but I think there's some of the same philosophy as Sekiro as well. Bayonetta's combat revolves around a mechanic called Witch Time. By dodging an attack at the last minute, using a distinct dodge action, enemies will be put into a slow motion state, allowing the player a few seconds to attack without risk. Additionally, the player is given attacks that grant a huge amount of points, but will also deal a huge amount of damage. While these can be used to quickly dispose of enemies, a score-focused player will instead use them to end combos on highly weakened enemies to help maximize their score. The Wonderful 101 takes the question and answer routine even farther. The player is given a distinct block move to complement the dodge taken from Bayonetta, and the player can also freely switch between several different weapons that have very different effects on enemies. For example, an enemy with spiky armor will only be vulnerable to the whip, while the sword will automatically reflect lasers. So are these the ultimate action games, perfectly combining the two styles of action game I've described here? Well, not in any objective sense. While I do love these games, I ultimately prefer Sekiro and Devil May Cry to both of them. Part of that is simply due to taste or other minor problems with the game design. I don't like the scoring system in Bayonetta as much as Devil May Cry 3, for example. But there's also a few flaws that I think betray the ideals of these two philosophies. One problem Bayonetta has is making sure that its huge amount of moves all have an actual use. Devil May Cry's style system encourages the player to use a wide variety of moves, while Bayonetta's scoring system isn't concerned with what moves the player uses, provided they don't spend too long between attacking enemies. This means that the player is more likely to find a few effective moves and repeat them ad nauseum while focusing entirely on defense. Or at least, that's what I've always ended up doing. Another problem can be focusing too much on the distinct uses of the player's actions. I mentioned earlier that the player in the Wonderful 101 can use the whip for spiking enemies. The problem is that the whip is only useful for spiking enemies, and several other weapons suffer from similar problems. The actions available to the player in Sekiro are almost always useful for multiple situations, and furthermore are easily used at any time. A player trying to dodge a sweep in Sekiro will simply jump over it, while a player in the Wonderful 101 will likely use a whip to tear off an enemy's spiky armor before switching back to the fist or sword to actually fight the enemy. That said, I do think Platinum's style of games have the potential to be better than the sum of their parts, so to speak, and I'm excited to see what they'll do in Bayonetta 3, which should be releasing any day now. Well, that's all I have to say for now. If you enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button below, or follow me on Twitch to see what weird stuff I'm into these days. Thanks for watching!